Africa is the second largest continent on Earth, bigger than the United States, China, India, and most of Europe combined. Yet if you look at a classroom map, Africa looks small, almost the same size as Europe. Greenland, which could fit into Africa about 14 times, is often shown nearly the same size. South America, which is almost twice the size of Europe, looks smaller. These aren't small mistakes. These are the kinds of distortions that shape how generations of people think about the world. The problem isn't that mapmakers are lying on purpose. It's that the Earth is round, and the moment you try to flatten a sphere onto paper, something has to give. You can't stretch and flatten an orange peel without tearing or warping it, and the same rule applies to the planet. So every map is a compromise. Some preserve shapes, some preserve distances, some preserve size, but no map can preserve them all. The map most of us grew up with, the one hanging in classrooms and printed in textbooks, is called the Mercator projection. It was made back in 1569 by Gerardus Mercator. At the time, it was revolutionary because it helped sailors navigate oceans more easily. A straight line on the map matched a straight course on a compass. For navigation, it was perfect. For showing the true size of the world, it was a disaster. The Mercator projection inflates everything near the poles and shrinks everything near the equator. That's why Europe looks much larger than it really is, while Africa looks smaller. Russia, Canada, and Greenland are blown up in size. Places like India, Brazil, and most of Africa are squeezed down. This isn't just a technical quirk, it's a distortion that affects how we see entire continents. Think about what this does to people's minds. If you grow up seeing Africa drawn small and Europe drawn large, you might unconsciously believe that Europe is more important, more powerful, or more central to history. When in reality, Africa is not only larger, it's also richer in resources, more diverse in cultures, and home to more people. Yet the way maps are drawn makes it feel less significant. And that's the deeper point here. Maps are not just neutral tools, they carry messages. In medieval Europe, mapmakers often put Jerusalem at the center of the world, not because it was geographically central, but because it was spiritually central to them. In the United States, many maps are drawn with America in the middle, slicing Asia into two pieces just to make the U.S. look like the center. Even the idea that North is always at the top is a choice, not a fact. Flip the map upside down, and suddenly the whole story of who looks big and important changes. So the reason Africa looks tiny next to Europe isn't a coincidence. It's the result of choices made hundreds of years ago that we've kept using, mostly out of habit. The Mercator map was never designed for classrooms. It was meant for sailors in the 16th century. Yet somehow it became the world's default map. And here's the irony. Once a map becomes familiar, it's very hard to unsee it. Even today, when cartographers and teachers point out the distortions, people still prefer the old Mercator map because it looks right. Our brains have been trained to accept it, even though it's wrong. This is where the story of maps becomes more than geography. It's about power, politics, and perspective. Who gets to decide how the world is drawn? Who benefits from looking bigger? And who loses by being shown smaller? These aren't just technical questions. They shape how we think about nations, continents, and even history itself. When people started pointing out the distortions of the Mercator map, cartographers tried to come up with better options. One of the most famous alternatives is the Gall-Peters projection. Instead of exaggerating Europe and shrinking Africa, the Gall-Peters map tries to keep the relative sizes of countries correct. Africa looks huge. South America stretches out, and Europe finally appears smaller, closer to its real proportion. But when teachers first introduced the Gall-Peters map in the 1970s and 80s, there was a lot of pushback. Some people said it looked ugly because it stretches continents vertically. Others complained that it distorted shapes too much. The truth is, all maps distort something. There is no perfect flat map of Earth. What the Gall-Peters projection did, though, was force people to confront the idea that the familiar map they trusted was misleading them. The argument over Gall-Peters wasn't really about geography. It was about perspective. People in Europe and North America had grown used to maps that made their countries look large and central. Suddenly, they were faced with a map that showed Africa and South America as much bigger and more important. That felt uncomfortable, even threatening. So the debate over maps became a debate over power and identity. It might sound strange that a piece of paper could influence worldviews, but think about how much we rely on maps. They hang in classrooms, offices, airports, even hotel lobbies. They're the backdrop of newscasts and documentaries. If the map behind a news anchor constantly shows Europe and North America as larger and central, you absorb that message without even realizing it. This isn't new. Maps have always carried hidden messages. During the age of exploration, European maps often left out parts of the world they hadn't reached yet, as if those places didn't exist until Europeans arrived. Colonial powers used maps to carve up Africa and Asia, drawing borders that ignored ethnic groups and local realities. During the Cold War, U.S. maps often showed the Soviet Union as a looming, massive red blob stretching across Eurasia, making it look more threatening than it really was. So when critics say the Mercator projection distorts Africa, it's not just a technical issue. It's part of a long tradition of using maps to tell a story that benefits some and diminishes others. If Africa looks small, it seems less significant. If Europe looks large, it seems more important. Those impressions sink into our subconscious and shape how we think about global history. Even today, the choice of map can stir controversy. In 2017, Boston Public Schools replaced their Mercator maps with Gall-Peters maps. Teachers said it was time to show students the world more accurately. But some parents complained that the maps looked wrong or confusing. The debate even reached the media, with some pundits mocking the change. But think about it. If children grow up seeing Africa at its true scale, wouldn't that change how they think about the world? And that's really the heart of the issue. Maps are not just about distances and coastlines. They shape worldviews. When you see the world differently, you think about it differently. You may question why Africa, with so much land and so many people, is often treated as less important in international politics. You may notice how South America, which produces vital resources, gets overlooked compared to Europe or North America. A simple shift in how we draw the world can trigger a shift in how we value it. But let's go a bit deeper. The Mercator projection also affects how we think about climate, development, and even security. The northern regions, Canada, Russia, Scandinavia, look huge, as if they dominate the planet. Yet in reality, much of that land is cold, sparsely populated, and less significant economically. Meanwhile, the equatorial regions, Africa, South Asia, Latin America, are home to billions of people, rich biodiversity, and key resources. But because they look smaller on the map, they're subconsciously seen as less. Think about global power, too. When leaders or businesses see their countries represented as larger, it reinforces a sense of dominance. When developing regions look smaller, it reinforces stereotypes of weakness. That might sound subtle, but visuals matter. It's the same reason countries design national flags or why companies spend millions on logos. Symbols influence how we think, even if we don't notice. Some people ask, why not just use a globe? After all, a globe shows the Earth with no distortion. That's true. But globes are harder to carry around or hang on walls. They're not as practical for classrooms or laptops. That's why we keep falling back on flat maps, even though they distort. The challenge is deciding which distortion we want to live with. Do we want a map that makes Europe and North America look bigger, or one that gives the developing world its true size? Another projection worth mentioning is the Robinson projection, created in the 1960s. It was meant to balance things out. Not perfect, but not extreme. Shapes are a little distorted, sizes are a little distorted, but overall it feels right. The Robinson projection is actually what National Geographic used for decades, until they switched to the Winkel Tripel projection in 1998, which they still use today. The Winkel Tripel also balances shape and size, and many geographers argue it's the best compromise for world maps. Yet even with these better maps, Mercator refuses to die. It's the default on many online platforms, including Google Maps. Why?
Because it's still useful for navigation. If you draw a straight line on Mercator, it corresponds to a constant compass bearing. That makes it great for sailors and pilots. The problem is, most people using Google Maps aren't navigating across oceans. They're zooming in on streets in their neighborhood. Yet we've inherited this centuries-old system, even though it wasn't designed for our needs today. So we're left with a strange situation. The map that dominates our walls, screens, and minds is one of the most misleading when it comes to showing the true size of the world. And the more you think about it, the more you realize how deeply this affects not just geography lessons, but politics, economics, and even how we value human lives. That's why the map debate isn't just about cartography. It's about what story we tell ourselves about the world. Who looks big and central? Who looks small and peripheral? These aren't neutral choices. They shape how generations of people think about history and power.
When you look at a standard world map, chances are you're looking at the Mercator projection. It's the one we all grew up with in classrooms. A rectangular map with Greenland near the top looking massive, Africa stretched wide but strangely short, and South America looking smaller than Europe. The problem? None of that is actually accurate. The Mercator map wasn't designed to represent the real size of countries. It was made centuries ago for sailors to navigate the seas. Its goal was to keep compass directions straight, not to keep land masses true to scale. And that's where the distortions come in. Think about Greenland. On most maps, Greenland looks almost the same size as Africa. But the truth is shocking. Africa is about 14 times larger than Greenland. You could fit Greenland inside Africa many times over. Yet in our minds, they sit by side as equals on the page. That single image already changes how we imagine the world. Africa seems smaller, less significant, while Greenland appears massive, even though it's not. The same distortion happens with Europe compared to South America. On most classroom maps, Europe looks comfortably bigger, or at least similar in size. But in reality, South America is almost double the size of Europe. South America stretches vast distances from the Caribbean all the way to the southern tip of Chile and Argentina. Yet because the Mercator projection pulls Europe upward on the map, it looks inflated. People often grow up with the false sense that Europe is the bigger continent, when in truth, it's far smaller. Now let's look at Alaska and Mexico. If you glance at a Mercator map, Alaska looks huge, almost like it could rival half the United States. But when you compare Alaska with Mexico, the illusion falls apart. Mexico is actually larger than Alaska in terms of population and even land area, depending on how you measure it. The only reason Alaska looks so exaggerated is that it sits closer to the North Pole, where the Mercator projection stretches things out. This stretching effect gets more dramatic the further north or south you go. Countries near the equator, like Kenya, Brazil, or Indonesia, get shrunk down, while countries in the far north, like Canada, Russia, or Norway, get blown up. That's why Canada looks like this enormous giant spanning half the globe, while Brazil looks modest. But in reality, Brazil is larger than the entire continental United States and about the same size as China. The map tricks our eyes into underestimating it. This isn't just a fun geography fact, it has consequences. For centuries, maps have influenced how people think about power, importance, and influence. A continent like Africa, shown smaller than it really is, ends up being underestimated in people's minds. Meanwhile, Europe, stretched and enlarged, looks dominant. That visual bias feeds into old ideas of who mattered in history and who didn't. One historian, James W. Lowen, pointed this out in his famous book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. He explained how the maps we see in schools are not neutral. They shape the stories we believe about the world. Lowen's point wasn't just about maps, but about history in general. The way it's presented changes how we think. And maps are one of the most subtle but powerful examples of this. They don't need to say anything, just their visuals plant ideas in our minds. Take Russia versus Africa, for example. On a standard map, Russia looks colossal, stretching across the top of the world, while Africa looks like a manageable land mass sitting below. But here's the truth. You can fit all of Russia, plus the United States, plus China, plus several European countries inside Africa and still have room to spare. Africa is that enormous, but no one sees it that way because the Mercator projection deflates it while inflating Russia. This is why alternative map projections, like the Gall-Peters projection, have been suggested for classrooms. The Gall-Peters projection tries to correct for these distortions by showing countries according to their actual land area. The result looks strange at first. Africa and South America suddenly balloon out, while Europe and North America shrink down to more realistic sizes. For many people, seeing that version of the world is almost shocking because it breaks a lifetime of visual habits. But the Mercator map is so familiar that it's hard to replace. It's the one hanging in classrooms, on globes, in atlases, and even in online tools like Google Maps, although Google does switch to a globe view when you zoom out far enough. The comfort of familiarity keeps it in use, even though it doesn't tell the truth about scale. So, let's imagine a few more comparisons. India versus Greenland. On most maps, Greenland looks bigger. In reality, India is more than 3 times larger than Greenland in land area, and it has over 1 billion people compared to Greenland's tiny population of under 60,000. Madagascar versus the UK. Often, the UK looks larger on maps, sitting up in the stretched northern zone. But Madagascar is actually almost twice the size of the United Kingdom. Africa versus the United States. Africa swallows the U.S. whole. In fact, you can fit the United States, all of China, all of India, and most of Europe inside Africa at once. That fact alone blows people's minds because the map never suggested anything like that. When you stack these examples together, you begin to see how much the Mercator projection has shaped a skewed worldview. We're not just talking about a minor distortion. These maps consistently make wealthy northern countries look larger and more important while shrinking the global south. And that lines up too neatly with old colonial worldviews to be just an accident. So, the next time you look at a world map, remember that what you're seeing isn't reality. It's a navigational tool turned into a teaching aid, and it's been influencing minds for centuries. The real world looks different. Africa looms large. South America sprawls bigger than you thought. And the equator is the home of the giants of our planet. But unless we question what we're shown, we might never realize how much we've been misled.
By now, it should be clear that maps and history textbooks are not just academic tools. They are instruments that influence how entire societies see themselves and others. The distortions may look harmless at first, but over time, they feed into real-world attitudes and decisions. And in the United States, those attitudes can be seen everywhere, in politics, in media, and even in foreign policy. Let's start with identity. When students grow up seeing their country at the center of the map and the center of the historical narrative, it reinforces the idea that America is not just one country among many, but the country. This belief feeds into what's often called American exceptionalism, the idea that the U.S. has a unique role as a global leader, almost destined to guide the world. Of course, every nation tells itself a flattering story, but in the U.S., the combination of skewed maps and selective history creates an especially strong sense of centrality. Now, compare that to how other regions are treated. Africa, for instance, doesn't just look smaller on the Mercator map, it also tends to disappear from classroom discussions except when slavery, famine, or poverty are mentioned. The result is that many Americans grow up with little knowledge of Africa's diversity, history, or contributions to the world. This isn't just a problem of ignorance, it directly shapes attitudes toward foreign aid, immigration, and international cooperation. If you believe a place is small and unimportant, you're less likely to view its people as equals on the world stage. The same logic applies to Latin America. On the map, it stretches down below the U.S., looking long and narrow. In textbooks, it often appears as a backdrop for U.S. policies. Think the Monroe Doctrine, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the War on Drugs, rather than as a region with its own complex histories. That framing subtly reinforces the idea that Latin America exists mainly in relation to U.S. interests, not as an independent force. These patterns don't just affect how students think about other countries. They also affect how they think about minority groups inside the U.S. Take Native Americans again. If their presence on the land is erased from maps and their stories are erased from textbooks, then it becomes easier to justify ignoring their rights today. Debates about pipelines on native land, for example, often reveal a widespread assumption that indigenous communities are in the way of progress rather than rightful stewards of their territory. The historical erasure feeds directly into modern injustice. But the influence goes even further. When maps and textbooks reinforce the same worldview, they can shape how entire governments see the world. During the Cold War, for example, U.S. policymakers often thought of countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America mainly as small pieces on a global chessboard. The distorted mental maps made it easier to dismiss those nations' own voices. Intervention after intervention was justified on the grounds that the U.S. had to step in and stabilize regions that were supposedly weak or underdeveloped. The ripple effects of those choices are still being felt today. Even now, the way maps are drawn continues to spark conflict. Look at debates over Israel and Palestine, or over Taiwan and China. In each case, the map you use reflects a political stance. To show Palestine as a separate state or not, to mark Taiwan as independent or as part of China, these are not just cartographic choices, they are political statements. That's why countries fight over how maps are drawn in textbooks and atlases. They know that the way a child sees a border on a map can shape how they think about legitimacy, sovereignty, and justice. Inside the U.S., debates over maps sometimes connect directly to education battles. When schools consider switching from the Mercator projection to the Gall-Peters projection, critics often complain that it's political correctness. But is it really political correctness, or is it just accuracy? After all, if the goal of education is to give students the best understanding of the world, why stick with a map that exaggerates some regions and minimizes others? The resistance shows how deeply people are attached to the worldview they grew up with, even if it's inaccurate. The same is true for history textbooks. Every few years, you'll see headlines about states fighting over what should be included in the curriculum. Should slavery be described as a central cause of the Civil War or as a side issue? Should the story of Japanese internment during World War II be highlighted or downplayed? Should textbooks mention America's role in foreign coups? Each of these debates is about much more than just words on a page. It's about shaping how future generations see their country and the world. This brings us back to Lowen's central point. What we teach students matters, because it influences not just their knowledge, but their values and their decisions as citizens. If you teach a sanitized version of history, you get citizens who are less likely to question authority or challenge injustice. If you teach a distorted view of geography, you get citizens who assume some parts of the world matter less than others. Both outcomes serve the interests of the powerful, but they don't serve the interests of truth. Of course, not everyone accepts this passively. Teachers across the country are experimenting with new methods. Some hang Gall-Peters maps alongside Mercator maps, letting students compare and ask questions. Some use primary sources to supplement their textbooks, showing students perspectives that were left out. These approaches don't just provide more accurate information, they also encourage critical thinking. They send the message that knowledge isn't something you just absorb, it's something you examine, question, and evaluate. In that sense, the debate over maps and textbooks is really a debate about what kind of education we want. Do we want education that reinforces the status quo, or education that challenges students to see beyond it? Do we want a world where Africa looks small and Columbus looks heroic, or a world where the scale of continents and the complexity of history are shown as they really are? The irony is that once students are exposed to these ideas, they often feel both shocked and relieved. Shocked that they were misled for so long, but relieved to finally see the bigger picture. That reaction shows just how powerful these tools are. Something as simple as changing the shape of a map or the framing of a story can open up whole new ways of understanding the world. So the next time you see a map on the wall or flip through a history textbook, it's worth asking, what story is this telling me? Who looks big and who looks small? Whose story is centered and whose story is missing? The answers might surprise you, but they also might help you see the world in a clearer, more honest way. In the end, maps and textbooks are mirrors. They reflect the choices of the people who made them, but they are also lenses, shaping the vision of the people who use them. And as long as those lenses are distorted, so will our view of the world. The challenge is to recognize the distortion, and then to look beyond it.